Our speaker this morning is our society's leader, Bart Worden. He has been executive director of the American Ethical Union, the National Federation of Ethical Culture and Ethical Humanist Societies, since June of 2012. Bart is, in addition, a social worker who has worked with programs that help people recover from psychiatric disability. Locally, Bart has been engaging with local groups to confront bias in law enforcement, undo systemic racism, and promote civil rights for all. And many of you have seen him out there engaged in the business of doing that, as well as in here. Today's address is titled, Getting Past Barriers to Living Ethically.
Good morning. Let's see how my vision is today. Okay. So what holds us back from being the best people we could be? What impediments do we face when we strive to make the world a better place, a place that's more kind, that has greater justice in it? These questions haunt me on a regular basis. Actually, even more so, 2 years ago I turned 60, and so there was this switch over into thinking, there's a real brevity to life, and there is a very limited window of opportunity going forward in terms of really making a difference. And as a tall, white adult male, which offers considerable privilege for me, I don't know from the more extensive barriers that people with fewer privileges face on a regular basis. And I'm inclined to suffer from the psychological fragility of my kind, which always tends to expect that things will go well, that they'll live comfortably and have success in life. And so even the small hurdles can be especially painful, but not necessarily justifiably painful. So that winds up being a problem for me. So I think about the barriers that are ahead of me. And some of these are internal, some of them are external, some are obvious, some are not so obvious. Some seem like they're surmountable and some not. And so trying to figure these things out and make a plan that I can actually live has been a more interesting time, shall I say, than I would have liked. So today what I wanted to do is take a look at this, but from the perspective of two narratives. So the first narrative is one about enslavement. This last week I took a class on anti-blackness and humanism that was offered by the Humanist Institute. And as part of the class preparations, we had 1,600 pages to read, which included a powerful and highly disturbing book, which is let me find the exact title so I don't screw that up. The Half Has Never Been Told, which is Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism. It's a book by Edward Baptist. And in this book, he goes through the 70 or so years between he's primarily looking at the migration of slaves that happened when the cotton industry really took off. So that's a large focus of this, and all the political and economic things that attended to that. The thing is, he focused especially on the stories of the people themselves. In the 1930s, when they were in the midst of the Depression, there was an effort to employ people all over the place. And one of the things that they did was they would hire these people to interview former slaves to get their stories. The thing is, this was actually a propaganda effort. In other words, there were set interview questions, and the questions were structured in such a way as to get a less troubling story about slavery than people would probably report on their own. But that didn't stop the people who were being interviewed from filling in a little bit more detail, shall we say. So we have all these accounts of people that were interviewed. Many people who had managed to survive enslavement also made it a point to find someone who could write down their story. and they would tell their stories. So there are many, many stories out there that you can access and get a better picture of what was really going on. And so in the book, what he does is weave the stories of the people who'd been enslaved with what was going on in the political realm and the economic realm. Right? And in particular, with the combined invention of the cotton gin and the development of a form of cotton that was easier to grow in many areas of the United States, that made a huge change in what was happening in this country. All right? And so that really made a huge change in terms of slavery. So I wanted to kind of share some of the story there. The other story, by the way, that will be competing with this is my efforts to engage with local activist group, Community Voices Heard, and some of the barriers that I encountered on that walk. But I think the enslavement one's got a little bit more punch, if you know what I mean. So the person that I'll be focusing on is a man named Charles Ball. And he was enslaved in Virginia and was actually a skilled slave who had been kind of jobbed out to do various things on mechanical things on boats and other kinds of things like that. But, with the cotton business really booming, this trade had been generated whereby wealthy planters would hire people to get people from the north where the economic situation wasn't so good and gather people and bring them down to the fields for the cotton industry. And so this is the story for Charles Ball and how that happened for him. So he was he was with his the person who had owned him, I guess, at the time, and had gone into town and was at this restaurant having a meal. And when he came out, a whole bunch of guys just jumped him, and it turns out that his master had sold him, but hadn't said a word about it. And so they jumped him, they put him in chains. So the way they did this, by the way, is they collected individuals. They just grabbed them off the street, basically, without any warning. So they had no preparation, no opportunity to talk. Like this guy was married, had a kid. Well, too bad. And so they would just take them and pull them together into these things called coffles. Anyone know a coffle? It was a new word for me. Yes, so they would have like rows and rows of people that they had chains, collars around the neck, steel collars around the neck, and then chains that went from collar to wrist, and then chains between their feet, and they would be all chained together, and it's like 20 pounds or so of chains, and then they would march them en masse for many miles a day. And they marched all the way to, in this case, from Virginia to South Carolina, which was over 600 miles. And of course, they were really well taken care of along this way, right? So they put the fastest people up front so that everyone had to keep up. And then they had a driver who would be behind them with a whip to catch anyone who was seeming to dawdle. And then they would give them very insufficient food and shelter on the way down as well. So it was just really this brutal campaign. Thing is, that wasn't the most brutal part of this, all right? So that was really horrible and really just haunting. But once they got to the fields, it was even worse because the way they had it set up was that they had everyone working in mass and in rows. And so you'd be assigned to a row, and the fastest worker would be at the head of the row. And so let's say they're hoeing the field, and so they're pulling up the weeds along the field. So the fastest person would be setting the pace, and everyone else had to keep up with this. And then they do a row, and then they move forward and do another row and do another row. And anyone who was falling behind was subject to getting whipped. And that's how they kind of kept things rolling. And so this would just go on, and anyone who showed any signs of what they might call uppityness or resistance or slowing or any of those kind of things was just soundly whipped, often to the point of real, not just pain, but real injury, sometimes death. It was just a brutal system. And then it came to the picking. Right? Well, it turns out picking cotton is an art form, and one that is difficult to learn. And we know this from Charles Ball's account. He was somebody who was strong and agile and skilled with his hands, and so the hoeing part went really well for him, and he became kind of the head of the row very quickly. But the picking was very different. The picking took a kind of finesse and a kind of quickness and a readiness to kind of let go of all your thinking and just focus like a machine on going past these plants and grabbing everything if you were going to be successful with this. And it required, the people who could make their quotas needed to do it with two hands. So there was this almost simultaneous effort of pulling and pulling. And you may notice, like, cotton is very light, so it takes quite a while to fill your bag of cotton, and you're pulling along. And the way they made sure that people kept pushing forward was they kept a tally for each person, your weight. And so at the end of the day, you drag your bag back and they hang it on a scale. And then they would give the weight for the day. And they would compare that to your weight from yesterday. And if it was behind, you got whipped brutally. If it was even, you might escape the whipping. But you can imagine, once people got so they could routinely make their weight, they would start upping the quota. And so it went from, I think, an average of, was it like 40 pounds of cotton a day to like 200 pounds a day or something really incredible like that. And the system was so efficient that there was no one in the world who could even remotely keep up with the United States. Right? So the brutality of this was how they managed to break everything from people's lives. They took them away from their families. They had no freedom. They had no income. They had, and this forced labor that would be sunrise to sunup, 6 days a week, sunrise to sunup, and it was just these horrible conditions. But it was the most efficient and effective way to get cotton into the bags and out for processing. And so it became the single largest driver by far of the American economy. Right? This is what made America great. Right? It's our cotton industry. Right? So not only is it from the sale of cotton that primarily went to England for the textile mills, but then people stole the designs for textile mills and brought them back to the United States so that we could do our own textiles. So think about Fall River, Massachusetts, all those cloths that came out of there at the time. And so then our industrial strength also became tied up with the cotton trade as well. And when you have this trade based on enslaved people working, the enslaved people became a commodity as well. All right? So some of the income that was coming was from the slave trade and from speculating, basically, on the price of slaves. Because what people would do is mortgage. You'd mortgage your slaves, right? That's how you would get more property. And that's how you get more slaves, in fact. And so there's this whole industry of derivatives. That sound familiar? Where people had this paper all over the place. And in several cases, there are these huge crashes when people, all of a sudden everything would fall apart, the bubble would burst, and nobody had the money to pay off their debts. And so then all hell would break loose. Of course, this being the United States, what people would do then is leave the country with their slaves so that they couldn't be caught, and that they would wind up in Texas, which wasn't part of the country at that time, and other parts west. So part of our westward expansion was built on this notion of people trying to escape their debts, right? So anyway, so the piece that I'm trying to figure out here is when we're talking about barriers. So what were the barriers the enslaved people were facing? I mean, there's so many. It's just remarkable that people survived at all through this. And yet they did. And it seems that one of the most important ones was for people to find a way to have relationships and community with other people. Right? So Charles Ball, again, taken from his wife and child, and just thrown into a cabin with a family, but he winds up becoming part of the family. So he is supportive to them, and he winds up adopting a kid himself, and this becomes a really important part of his agreeing to keep striving. He had someone to live for, someone to take care of, right? So one of the things that helped him through the barriers of enslavement was his connection to other people and his dedication to making sure that he could take care of someone else. So that was one. And the other one was, it turns out, music and dancing and other kind of things were actually a pretty important part of the life of enslaved people. And Saturday nights was revelry night, basically. And so they would have these times where people would dance around the fires and sing and have all these long evenings of revelry. And this also became something that put some wind in the sails of people. They could get through a week knowing that at the end of it, they could take a break. They could enjoy each other for a moment and try to forget what their life was like the rest of the time. And these pieces were enough to sustain people over long periods of time. Now, in his case, he wound up getting sold off to the daughter of the person that had purchased him, and moved to another place, and was very successful there. I mean, he was a strong, smart, capable person, and that wound up being a problem. That his success got people nervous that he was going to be too independently minded, and so he was beaten to within an inch of his life. And resolved at that point to leave, which he did. And so he made the 600-mile journey back to, I guess his wife was in Baltimore at that time, to Baltimore, by basically living in the woods, hiding out. He wound up getting arrested, but was able to break out of the jail. I mean, quite a wild time, but managed to get back to Baltimore and get reunited with his wife and child. How many years of being away. So for him, the barriers were there. He was able to surmount some. But you have to wonder, what was left for this person in terms of trying to put together what had been stolen from him for so many years? Right? The life that he could have had. Right? So when I start thinking about my own narrative, it's hard not to just come at this, first of all, with a heavy dose of shame. Right? The privilege that I experience now is on the backs of these folks. Right? This is how I've come to have this place here. And the privileges that accrue to people that look like me are still I'd like to think it's vestigial, but it's really not. It's the direct outpouring of the way we were able to objectify people and put them as objects in our lives that were there for our convenience, and to punish any change from that. So I've been aware that this is something that I just don't want to live with. This is a barrier to my belief that human beings have the capacity to behave well, to be good, to bring justice into the world. A significant barrier. So it was a great pleasure to me to come upon Community Voices Heard, which is a local grassroots group. And part of it was because I was getting involved with lots of groups, but it seems like we spend a whole lot of time meeting and talking, but it really wasn't making a real difference in the lives of people. I guess it made a difference in our lives because we got to feel like, okay, we're really understanding this better, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of people on the ground, I wouldn't say I was seeing a whole lot of difference. So I was really quite taken when I went to my first meeting where the Community Voices heard, looking around and noticing lots of people that were fresh faces. This was not the usual suspects that were gathering here. In fact, when I went to one in my own town, I really expected I'd show up at this hall that would have like 5 or 10 people in it. Wound up being several hundred people, most of whom walked there, right? So they managed to host this meeting, get the word out by word of mouth, and to gather people together in a really helpful way. The other thing they did in that meeting, they had simultaneous translation. So they had these devices, very much like the hearing things that those hearing assistant things we have here. But one set was for Spanish speakers, and the other set was for English speakers. And so there was simultaneous translation going on. So it always sounded a little funny because there's always a voice going in addition to the people speaking. But that was because we wouldn't have to go through this thing where somebody would say something and then somebody else would go through the whole thing and say it again. And then somebody say it and then somebody would say it again. Instead, everyone got to hear together. That was such a powerful thing. The other powerful thing is their belief that it's very difficult to change people's minds, but a little bit less difficult to change policies. And so this meant that your activity was really important. It wasn't enough to meet. You had to get out there and do something. So I really liked all that. And I got really involved. I was lying on the ground in different places. We took over a diner at one point, and even the Pleasantville market on a Saturday. That was interesting. There are a number of things that we did here as this group where we were really making some noise and getting some things to be heard, and they managed to get some real things passed. $100,000 put aside for a housing assessment, which didn't get spent yet, but at least they got it set aside. A number of after-school programs that got funded, additional money for child care for people on low incomes, a number of things like that they did that really made a difference in people's lives. In fact, in another week or so, they're going to be successful in getting an Emergency Tenant Protection Act in place in the village of Ossining, which will provide rent stabilization and eviction protection for about 1,200 people, I think, in the village, which is, substantial, right? And for those 1,200 people, this is a real game changer. So I really love this kind of activity. So what's the barrier? Well, the barrier is I got a call. The call said, we really appreciate your support for Community Voices Heard, but we want you to stop attending our organizing meetings. Why would that be? Well, because I look like me. Right? When I attend an organizing meeting, it's not unusual for the other folks there that are people from the community to look over and first of all wonder, am I going to take charge of the meeting? And if not, what am I doing there? Right? And are there things that I know that they'll expect me to be saying and doing, et cetera, et cetera? And it was suppressing the leadership of the people in the community. Just my presence. And by the way, it wasn't like I went there thinking, I'm going to make sure this community runs. I was learning. These guys were doing power analyses. These guys were doing trainings, facilitation trainings for their leadership to help them deal with like elected officials and things. It was really masterful. And so I was learning a lot. That was the biggest trouble for me, is I'm thinking, where am I going to learn this stuff except from these masters? But I understood though. You cannot insert yourself into a world and expect that it's not going to have an impact. So the barrier for me became, well, what am I going to do then? I mean, this is a group that I really relied on to be helpful. And I got approached a couple weeks ago by someone else who was in a similar situation, another white guy from Irvington this time. And he said, look, there's a need. And that need is for an additional paid organizer for Community Voices Heard. In other words, they have lots of volunteers, but in order to really organize effectively, you need to have people who can dedicate substantial time and attention people who can go for additional trainings and develop their skills and be around to go to the important sessions that can really make a difference. And that means employees. But grassroots organizations have a hard time getting access to the usual funding streams. And a big reason for that is because usual funding streams are controlled by people who look like me, right? United Way, think about the places where you might go for money. The government, the people who are making the decisions about these things are very much part of the traditional power structure. And so if they're to get this to go, they need to work outside of that. So they're putting together a group of about 10 to 12 people. And each one is promising to raise $10,000 for this $100,000 that are needed for this position. So, what's the barrier? I don't know about you. Do you like giving over $10,000? Anyone? Anyone have $10,000 like to give? Do you like asking other people to give money? Right? These are barriers in our lives. Right? I think partly, again, we become accustomed to this sense that what we have is ours. What we have, we deserve, we earned, I don't know, however else you want to put it. And there's a resentment that comes when people ask us for money. There's a resentment that comes when we think about, well, I'm going to give up my hard-earned dollars, I'm going to give up this. And there's a worry that comes when we're in a position to be encouraging other people to give too. But I'm going to do that. In fact, I'm doing that right now, if you may notice. This is probably not that subtle. $10,000 is significant, and I can make a good chunk of the way there. In fact, the truth of the matter is, I can get all the way there. It's a matter of will. It's not a matter of capacity. I can get all the way there. I want to get there with other people, though. I want to get there with giving more people the opportunity to surpass the barriers that they're experiencing. And one way that I'd recommend thinking about this is by thinking about what's happened economically for the population of the United States since the emancipation in 1867, was it? 63. Thank you, Oliver. I can always depend on Oliver. From 1863. For black families, when you compare, you hold everything else steady, college education, where they live, et cetera, their wealth is many times less than the comparable median wealth of white families. Many times less. And that has been true the entire time. And some of this is because of, actual efforts to ensure that blacks don't generate capital. Right? There have been many, many ways that that's been affected. And once you have that diversion, it's very difficult to keep up. All right? I think we should be aware of this when we're making our decisions about where we're sending our money. I think if we would like to see black families become empowered, helping them have a more equivalent capacity and resources would be a good start. Right? Because without it, we really can't. There was this a podcast on money that I was listening to the other day, and one of the experiments they did, they wanted to get some handle on how people dealt with unearned privilege. And so they used the Monopoly game. Anyone heard this podcast, by the way? It was a TED Talk. Okay, so they used the Monopoly game, and the way they did it was they rigged it so that they would have two people playing it, and one person would be given advantages, at least twice as much bank money, they got an extra die to roll, and the other person would not. In fact, they might have even reduced there. I'm trying to remember if they made it even worse for that person or not. But anyway, then they would play the game. And everyone would know this, right? It's not like it was a secret. Right? All the players would know. And then after the game, remarkably, guess who would win all the time? The person who was able to roll around the board and spend more money, right? And then they would interview the players afterwards. And of course, the players that lost were like, well, what did you expect? The interesting thing was the players that won. How did they account for their winning? They talked about their skill. They talked about the clever moves they made, right? And they kind of stopped thinking about, well, I did start with a head start of an extra $100,000, but that was a small potatoes, It's like that for us, right? It's so easy for us to forget our own indebtedness, forget that the things that we have now are stolen from other people in many ways, shapes, or form. And to get past the barrier that we have of seeing this as a fact in life, and not just in our lives, but in the lives of everyone in this country. And in many places of the world too, but certainly let's focus a little close to home if we can here. So let's think about these barriers that we face, these barriers of thinking, these barriers of doing. And let's figure out a way to get past them. Because a more ethical world is more likely to come if we can generate more equity and fairness in the world that we live in.